Did you know that ancient civilizations had their own version of town planning? In today's episode, we will be taking a look at what the towns of the past looked like, along with some of their features. Most ancient towns were built around a central plaza, which often had a temple or a palace were made of stone, and they used a technique called terracing to create flat surfaces on hillsides. They would then plant crops on these terraces and use the mountains as natural borders to their town. The Egyptians, on the other hand, built their towns on the Nile River. They built canals and bridges to connect different parts of the city and used a grid system to plan out their streets. No matter where they were built, ancient towns were usually surrounded by walls for protection. The Greeks, for example, built their towns on top of hills, so that they could have a clear view of the surrounding areas. They also built large public buildings like theaters and stadiums in the center of town. So what did the towns of the past look like? They were usually planned out and had a variety of different features depending on the civilization. Why do modern cities look the way they do? I mean, just look at this crazy quilt of streets. It looks like total chaos, right? But there's actually a method to this madness. So let's take a little field trip back in time and see how the world's first town planners wove their magic. First stop, ancient Egypt. We all know about the pyramids, but did you know that Egyptian cities were also super planned out? They had straight wide boulevards lined with buildings that were all built in the same style. They even had things like public works projects and building codes. Like, imagine building your dream house in the desert. You'd probably want it to blend in with all the other houses. And that's exactly what people in ancient Egypt did. They used mud brick to build their homes, which is why you can still see the remains of these ancient cities today. The buildings were all the same color and the same material, so the city looked neat and orderly. And don't forget about those fancy boulevards. They weren't just for decoration. They were designed to keep the city clean. The streets were lined with trash cans and public bathrooms, and the city had a bunch of public spaces where people could hang out and enjoy themselves. Now, this might sound a little weird, but Egyptian cities were also really green. They had parks and gardens everywhere, and the government even hired people to take care of them. But let's move on to our next stop, Mesopotamia. This ancient civilization was known for its love of geometry and everything symmetrical, and it shows in their town planning. They laid out their cities in perfect grids, with the main temple or palace in the center. Everything else was arranged around that, nice and symmetrical. The streets were super straight, and they even had things like public squares and roundabouts. But don't get too excited. Mesopotamian cities weren't all sunshine and roses. They had their fair share of problems, like flooding and pollution, but they tried to solve them in pretty innovative ways. For example, they built canals to water their crops and carry away sewage. They also had public works projects to repair roads and buildings, but sometimes these projects were a little too ambitious, and they ended up causing more problems than they solved. Like, remember that time they tried to build a giant ziggurat, and it collapsed and killed a bunch of people? Yeah, that was not a great moment for Mesopotamian town planning. And now for our final stop, the Mayans. These guys were known for their amazing architecture and their even more amazing calendar system. But did you know that they were also into town planning? Mayan cities were super huge and super dense. They had everything from palaces and temples to marketplaces and even zoos. And just like the Egyptians, the Mayans loved to make everything look nice and orderly. They built their cities in grids with wide boulevards and public spaces. They also had building codes so that everyone's house looked the same and the city looked neat. But unlike the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians, the Mayans didn't have any professional architects or engineers. They had to do everything themselves. And let's just say they weren't very good at it. Their buildings were always falling apart and they had to spend a lot of money repairing them. And because they couldn't figure out how to properly drain the water away from the city, they had a serious mosquito problem. But despite all these setbacks, Mayan cities were some of the most amazing places to live in the ancient world. I mean, who wouldn't want to live in a place with amazing architecture, a huge zoo, and a perfectly symmetrical grid? Well, if you hate symmetry, I guess that's one strike against it. But hey, you can't have everything. So what can we learn from these ancient civilizations? Well, for starters, it's important to have a plan. I mean, just look at what happens when there's no plan. Also, it's important to have some flexibility. Things won't always go according to plan, so be prepared to make changes. And finally, don't be afraid to experiment. Who knows, you might just invent something that the Mayans were too afraid to try.